All right, let's get started. Hi, everybody. I'm Alexandra Gibbons, and I'm the CEO here at the Center for Democracy and Technology. We're thrilled to welcome so many folks here in person, and also are grateful to all of you who are joining us over the live stream. And we're particularly honored to partner with NTIA today in launching their public consultation process on widely available AI foundation model weights. This is one of numerous work streams. I think we've counted over 160 launched by the Biden administration's AI executive order. And under the order, the Commerce Department has 270 days to solicit input and submit a report and recommendations to the president on potential risks, benefits, and other implications of foundation models with widely available model weights and appropriate policy and regulatory approaches. We're pleased that NTIA is starting this public consultation so swiftly and with a commitment to seeking broad public engagement. That engagement is important because the issues presented here are particularly complex. CDT was one of the most vocal groups, urging the Biden administration to push forward with the AI executive order and urging the administration to act swiftly to address the ways in which AI is currently impacting consumers, workers, and people's civil rights and civil liberties. But on questions like the approach to open source and AI, there are still hard issues to work through, and it's right for the administration to act carefully and deliberately. We hope to surface a number of those complex issues today, and we will with some thoughtful moderating. This includes exploring the important role of open ecosystems in driving competition, empowering user choice, and facilitating innovation in security, transparency, and testing. It includes pushing ourselves to articulate the risks of open model weights with specificity, to assess whether limits on open release methods would really mitigate those risks and how. Throughout, we'll push ourselves to talk with nuance about different approaches to model release, recognizing there is no binary of open versus closed, and there are steps responsible actors can take right now to reduce risks in their release approaches. Importantly, this conversation isn't just taking place today. NTA will need thoughtful contributions throughout their consultation on these issues. And additionally, policymakers and governments outside the US are grappling with all of the hard questions we're going to talk through today. I'll say that CDT is deeply involved in this work, and we're eager to share information and ideas with others too as we build the community talking about these issues and engaging with thoughtful policy recommendations. To start this conversation, I'm pleased to welcome Alan Davidson, who is Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communication and the Director of NTIA, who will give remarks before we transition immediately to our panel. Thank you all again, and thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Alex, and for that introduction and for your leadership here at CDT. And I just have to say, as our society takes on these giant policy challenges that artificial intelligence brings, we are so lucky to have a more sophisticated set of civil society players on the field than we've ever had before. And I really believe that that level of excellence is personified by CDT and the work of your new AI governance lab. So congratulations on that, and thank you again for hosting us. We're here today because of the growing power of technology in our daily lives. Advances in AI and machine learning systems have captured the public's imagination, and rightly so. These new systems will impact nearly every corner of our economy and our lives. The starting point for the Biden administration has been that responsible AI innovation can and will bring enormous benefits to people. But we'll only realize the promise of AI if we also address the serious risks that it raises today. And those include concerns about safety, security, privacy, discrimination, and bias, risks from disinformation, impacts on the labor market. For these reasons and more, there's a strong sense of urgency across the administration and among governments around the world to engage on these issues. President Biden's AI executive order, the most significant government action to date on AI, brings the full capabilities of the US government to bear. And the Commerce Department is playing a leading role in the administration's AI work. The department's leading efforts on privacy, security, safety, innovation, competition, equity, and IP-related, intellectual property-related concerns. Our colleagues at NIST are standing up a new AI Safety Institute. The Patent and Trademark Office is exploring copyright issues. our trade administration is promoting trade in US companies. And we at NTIA are trying to do our part. We are doing our part. We are on the verge of releasing a report around AI accountability. We're engaged on the policy efforts across all of these areas at the department. And one area that we'll be focusing on at the direction of the executive order is AI openness. In particular, the benefits and risks posed by widely available model weights. This includes model weights that have been open sourced or otherwise broadly distributed. And note my use of the air quotes around open source. We know that what people commonly call open source in AI is very different than the way that what we mean in the context of open source software, for example. And in fact, I think part of our homework assignment, our collective homework assignment here, is bringing better precision to this conversation when we talk about things like open source AI. AI openness raises important questions around safety challenges and opportunities for competition and innovation. Like open source software years ago, the early conversations about open source AI have engendered fears about safety and misuse as a starting point. Just a few weeks ago, I was at a conference and heard a prominent venture capitalist argue in reference to open AI models that, quote, you don't open source the Manhattan Project, right? So that's one, maybe an extreme statement of it, but there are clear concerns about the power of AI and the dangers of making the most advanced frontier models widely available without any restriction or safeguard against misuse. On the other hand, we know, and we've heard from people concerned about the impact on competition and innovation if only a small set of players control access to the most important models. History has shown us that closed systems can undermine experimentation and prevent technological advances, can actually undermine security. And we know that technology's benefits can be distributed more widely when access to that technology is democratized. This does not need to be an either-or debate. As Alex so rightly noted in her initial remarks, this is not a binary choice about how we release models. We should seek policies that promote both safety and allow for broad access. To do so, we're going to need your help. That is why I'm so pleased to join all of you today as NTIA kicks off our public engagement in our review of AI openness. This review will lead to policy recommendations that seek to maximize the value of open source AI tools while minimizing the harms. And we're eager to hear from you. What should we focus our work on? What are the important questions to answer? And I know we have an all-star panel today to help us start that conversation. We're keenly interested in the pragmatism of any approach that we take. We want this work to be grounded in the technical, economic, and legal realities of how AI is developing and being deployed. Today's consultation is the start, and it's just the start. We anticipate more opportunities to gather public input coming shortly in the new year. So in conclusion, I'll just say safe and trustworthy AI innovation and use, it's an ambitious goal, right? The challenges on all of these different projects before us, they're daunting. But I am encouraged by one thing, and that is really all of you. The conversations like the one we're having today, like others happening around the world, they're evidence of a level of engagement on technology that's quite rare in our recent history. You know, governments are stepping up at this moment. Businesses and civil society groups and technologists are stepping up. And this is our moment. Right? The potential for technology to promote human progress has never been greater. Making the right decisions now will lead us to a world where technology works in service of a more open, free, equitable, and just society. Together, I know we can build that better version and vision of our future. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Alan, for those remarks. I'm Kevin Lee. I work in policy at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's Office of Policy Analysis and Development, and I am really delighted to introduce for all of you our all-star panel on AI. And as I call your name, please come on up. So first we have Kevin Bankston, who is Senior Advisor on AI Governance at CDT. where he supports CDT's AI Governance Lab in its mission to advance robust solutions to AI risks. Kevin previously served in a wide range of roles across civil society, including at the American Civil Liberties Union and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, as a previous director of CDT's Free Expression Project, and as director of the OTI at New America. Next, we have Peter Shion. Peter is Senior Policy Manager at GitHub. He works on public policy to support software developer communities across the world with a focus on AI and cybersecurity. He's published research on the regulation, international governance, and labor implications of AI, and serves on the OECD network of experts on AI. Prior to GitHub, he served as a researcher at the Center for Governance of AI. Then part of the University of Oxford, and consulted for the OECD AI Policy Observatory and Global Catastrophic Risk Institute. Next, we have Sayash Kapoor. Sayash is, Sayash is a computer science PhD candidate at Princeton University's Center for Information Technology Policy. His research focuses on the societal impact of AI. He previously worked on AI in the industry and academia at Facebook, Columbia University, and EPFL Switzerland. And last but not least, we have Elizabeth Sager. Elizabeth is a research scholar at GovAI, where she investigates foundation model release strategy and policy. Elizabeth holds a PhD in philosophy of science and technology from the University of Cambridge, where she remains a research affiliate with the AI Futures and Responsibility Project. So I'm really delighted to have the chance to be up here with such a distinguished panel. And as Assistant Secretary Davidson mentioned, we're here today to launch the very beginning of our public consultation on our work under Section 4.6 of the AI Executive Order, which asks us to assess the risks and benefits of dual-use foundation models with widely available model weights. And of course, that's a mouthful. And so I want to start with a level-setting question on the nomenclature and how the nomenclature affects the substance of what we're working on. The EO comes with a definition of dual-use foundation models, which have to have tens of billions of parameters and meet some other thresholds. But it doesn't actually define the term widely available model weights. And as Assistant Secretary Davidson mentioned, we've often been using the term open source in discussions about openness. So how should we be thinking about the scope of widely available model weights relative to something like open source, which might carry other connotations? Elizabeth, you want to get us started?
Sure. So for widely available model weights, as it's outlined in the executive order, it sounds like just publicly accessible model weights. I think that this, and others will probably be able to speak to this as well, it's only part of the definition of what we think about when we talk about open source AI systems. I think one thing with open model weights is a lot of the risks that we're concerned about with open model weights. These risks come to bear when just the weights are open, but oftentimes the benefits of open sourcing are not fully achieved with only the weights available. We need lots of other model components available. For example, training code, training data, model documentation, support with compute infrastructure, support tools, education. And I think you were speaking to this earlier. We were having a conversation. I don't know if you want to expand on this theory.
Yeah, sure. So I think to me, there are two key distinctions that come in. What I like to call open foundation models, which is closely aligned to what the executive order refers to as widely available weights, are models where the weights can be downloaded by a large section of the population. So this includes Meta's Llama models, where a large number of researchers have been able to download these models, and also includes other more permissively released licenses, such as Eleuther.ai's GPT Neo X. So the first distinction to me is that the model weights are widely available. The second distinction is if we move along the gradient of openness, what is typically or traditionally referred to as open source would, in my view, be models which are released alongside the code that's used to train them, the data that's used to train them, and they have no use restrictions in their license. So a key part of what constituted open source software in the last 3 decades has been permissively licensed software, which does not have use restrictions on how users can use these models downstream. And so I think there are two key distinctions on this gradient of release: open foundation models, meaning the weights are available, but open source models, which I think leads to a much more expansive view of what types of assets are made available publicly. And as Elizabeth mentioned, I think a number of the key concerns that come in with malicious use happen at the wait step, simply because in order to use these models for malicious purposes, things like disinformation or biorisk and so on, the concerns arise as soon as you have access to the weights. But on the other hand, to answer scientific questions of interest, things about bias or discrimination, things about how secure these models are, or whether we can even verify what data these models were trained on, we need access to other assets, things like the code that was used to train the model, as well as the data set. So in my view, when we're thinking about the risks, I think the key distinction is open versus closed. That is, whether we have the foundation model weights openly available. But when you're thinking about the benefits, we need to move along the gradient and think about whether the other assets required to train these models are also available as well.
Great points to get us started. I certainly agree that it's insufficient to really have the weights alone to see a lot of the benefits. I think it's important to reference in these definitional conversations, and I think it was quite elegant of the Biden administration to kind of use a new term to sidestep what is a controversial discussion in the community around what is exactly an open source AI system or model. It's important to reference kind of the OSI, the Open Source Initiative, as the arbiter of the open source software definition, which we could spend a lot of time diving into the minutia of. I think it's just important to think of the four kind of principles that undergird what has enabled everything, right? So thinking about the right to scrutinize the code, the right to run the code for any purpose, as you're referencing, the right to modify the code, and the right to redistribute the code as useful kind of guiding posts for open source software. And then the key question that the initiative is grappling with is, how does that translate in practice to open source AI models? So this broader framing of widely available model weights, or perhaps kind of openly available AI components, I think is a constructive start. I would also say that the EO has a lot of great things, and I think we'll spend a lot of time kind of touching on some of those points. One aspect that I do really appreciate is moving towards precision on some of these risks. So the consultation, as I understand it, is focused on dual use models with widely available widely available model weights. And that is to say the dual use definition is, to your point, larger models, 10+ billion parameters that have particular concerns for weapons of mass destruction creation, for cyber offense, and for loss of control. And I think narrowing that conversation is a useful step because there's so much benefit to be seen, and we can have a more precise conversation about the risks. Happy to dive into it as we go.
Well, that's a really helpful segue into, we've been talking a little bit about the 4 pillars of open source. Sayash, you mentioned a little bit about how those might be one of the dimensions of open source or of model openness, but not necessarily the only one. There are a lot of equities across the board in openness and AI. So are there what potential benefits or harms arising from openness are top of mind for folks right now?
I'll start with that one. And I'll start with benefits. Because open source has been getting a bit of a bad name in this conversation, and I want to remedy that a bit, because speaking generally, I'd say that the ready analogy to open source AI, the most ready analogy, is open source software. And we can look to the history of open source software and its context. We were in a very similar period to now, I think, in the 90s, when there was a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around the proliferation of open source software. It was suggested that it was more insecure, that it was socialist, that it was giving away our innovations to our competitors. Encryption source code was treated like a munition, although the courts ultimately did not like that. But we today live in a world where the vast majority of websites are hosted on Linux boxes, open source Linux boxes with open source Apache web hosting software. We access them through browsers, including Mozilla's Firefox and Chrome, which were what enabled meaningful competition against Microsoft's Internet Explorer. We often access that on an open source Android phone, which enabled multiple hardware companies to compete with Apple in the smartphone realm. And so we have a ready analogy to the benefits of openness in software looking at that history. And although certainly it has not been magic competition juice that solves all concentration problems, I would say that the world we have today, with certainly a few walled gardens and a few dominant players, but also an enormous long tail of innovation and web hosts and software writers, that would certainly be preferable to the counterfactual, which would have looked a lot more like AOL and Microsoft, no offense to either of them, being the main engines of the information economy, and all of us having less access to information, less access to the economic benefits of these tools. So that's how I think about the benefits of openness. I'll add, in terms of the risks that are most top of mind, certainly for CDT, our biggest focus and concern is discriminatory decision-making by automated systems. We think, although we still working on this as part of the governance lab's work, it seems that many, if not most, of the mitigations around specific decision-making systems would happen at the deployment layer, not at the foundation model layer. And so I personally, I think, worry most about the problems that will come with open source AI that have also been intractable on an open internet, those being in particular illegal sexual content, fraud, and things like that, things that have been that have grown exponentially with the exponential growth of all of our other information technology. And I don't think we have clear answers on how to combat that while also balancing burdens on free expression and innovation.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, so if I could jump in. So first of all, I want to say, Kevin, that I agree with absolutely everything you said. I'm going to layer on top of it, though, I think, with a few other concerns and ideas. First, I'm going to start with the risks. And the risks that have been forefront on my mind and the work that I've been doing have mostly been risks around misuse and security concerns. So these are risks around foundation models and generative AI being used, for example, to build biological weapons, chemical weapons, produce malware. And I think that there's a really important point to be made here is that, like, the marginal addition of risks that we're seeing right now from current AI systems is not that much more than being able to just Google this information. And I think that's a really strong argument. However, I would add that a lot of people who are worried about open sourcing of models aren't necessarily worried about the models that we currently have, but are worried about the capabilities that might emerge in the future. So while I completely agree that the marginal risk is currently small, I think that there's prudence still demands sort of watching what's happening on the frontier, looking out for the development of new capabilities, and being careful about the decisions that we might make around releasing weights as capabilities continue to develop, as we're able to integrate different systems with each other, and as they become more user-friendly. Second, I want to talk about the software analogy. I think that this is a really a good analogy in terms of illustrating the benefits of open source and showing that, especially in this offense-defense balance, open sourcing has allowed defensive capabilities to grow, even though open sourcing does pose risks and vulnerabilities. If you open source a system, we can find those vulnerabilities, we can patch them. This wide distributed community-based innovation is really important for safety and developing defensive capabilities. I think, however, that we should at least consider the possibility that this analogy might not hold perfectly in the case of AI systems. One concern that I've been thinking about is that while in the case of traditional software, this offense-defense balance obviously has tilted very strongly in the direction of defense, that it might tilt more towards offense. I'm not so sure how far, but more towards offense with the more highly capable systems that we develop. The reason being that the issues, the vulnerabilities, the bugs, they're just as easy to find and exploit, but potentially much more difficult to patch and to solve than the case of traditional software. AI safety is difficult. It takes a lot of money, a lot of expertise that we're pouring into it. And it is lagging behind the rate of AI development. So that would be, I'm not 100% sure how far towards offense will tilt, but I think we should be open to considering that offense-defense balance might not work out in the same way the more highly capable the systems get.
I mean, I'll just add, I think that's definitely a possibility. I think it's also a possibility it will help on defense. I mean, for example, open source tools may be the way that we can develop better AI detection tools, for example. And so I'm not arguing with you. I'm noting that there's a dearth of evidence for either direction.
Yeah, I think that this is an area.
At this point.
I think this is an area, though, where we need more research, because I don't think it's necessarily as obvious as in the software case.
Yeah, and this is another reason that the EO is so fantastic about trying to launch pilots with DHS, DoD, discovering and patching vulnerabilities at scale using large language models in critical software code. We need more attention to the defensive use of large language models and AI. Government can clearly lead on some of these pilots. I think broadly, we do need more research on this offense-defense balance question, but generally on AI safety and security. And that's a clear benefit of open source releases to date. There's multiple repeated references, if you spend too much on Twitter, as I do, from folks in the AI safety community, acknowledging that research has really advanced because of the open release of Llama 2, both to kind of model oversight and model interpretability questions on the safety side, and exploits on the security side from prompt injection that affect open and closed models alike. So we should certainly be expanding those types of research, and open releases to date have helped with that. It's important to acknowledge the contributions to reproducible science that open source and open science supports.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I want to quickly jump into some of the risks as well, and to see like what evidence we have today and where we stand on those. So one of the main risks that has been talked about with respect to open foundation models is the risk of cybersecurity threats. So in particular, the two key things that stand out are language models can be used to automatically find vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure and therefore hack into systems more easily. That's fun. And the second is language models will be used to create malware, which can then be used to sort of infiltrate other systems. So let's dive into a little bit of the history of both of these, because I think if you go to it from like the perspective of this empirical history of how such transitions have played out in the back, I don't know, like in the last 3 decades or so, I think that can be very informative. So on the first concern on finding vulnerabilities using automated tools, this is not the first time that we have superhuman capabilities at vulnerability detection. In fact, at least for the last 3 decades, we've had these things called fuzzing tools. So fuzzing tools are used in cybersecurity to automatically find bugs. They sort of put in inputs to existing software, try to tweak them and find vulnerabilities this way. And they've been used to find tens of thousands of vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. So why hasn't the world ended? Why haven't we sort of come to a point where everything is hacked all the time? Well, the reason is that defenders have access to the same tools. So fuzzing tools have been used predominantly by cyber defense organizations and by people who are trying to protect critical infrastructure. In fact, one of the most prominent uses of the tool has been this initiative called OSS Fuzz, which automatically finds issues in prominent open source libraries and alerts the developers and prompts them to fix these issues. So that's the first one. Like, I think the same would hold true for language models as well. In fact, we've already seen the use of language models, to Peter's point, on detecting these vulnerabilities. Google has launched this thing called SecPalm. It's a security, vulnerability detection version of their Palm language model, which is already being used to expand access to vulnerability detection tools. And similarly for malware as well, Google has developed this foundation model that can detect new forms of malware. And you can upload a piece of software to check on this website called VirusTotal. Not an advertisement, but really like these types of tools have already started being used for defense. And I think there is very little reason to expect that the offense-defense balance in terms of cybersecurity, at least for these types of issues like malware detection or malware creation and vulnerability detection, would be any different for any automated tools in the future. And to Peter's point, I think a lot of open models have enabled this type of research on how useful these tools can really be for cybersecurity detection. And they've also allowed companies to deploy these models locally rather than sending their outputs to like OpenAI in implementing these types of detection and vulnerability assessment tools in-house. So that's one. And then I'll very quickly jump into biorisk as well. So I think the question on biorisk again is what is the marginal risk? As Elizabeth mentioned, I think it's true that today's models are not really, or we don't have any evidence that today's models are much better than like just searching on Wikipedia. There were a couple of studies that came out of MIT a few months back, and I think they sort of panicked a little bit and said that, if you use Llama 2, you can create bioweapons. Well, it turns out that if you search the internet, in fact, if you search Wikipedia, you can find the exact same answers. A report from the National Academies of Sciences in 2019 had the exact lines of information, in fact, that was referenced in these reports. And so unless we're also trying to set out to ban like the National Academies of Sciences from putting out reports and censoring Wikipedia, I think we're on a very slippery slope there. So I think it's very important, as Elizabeth mentioned, I think it's important to think about how we can take steps to protect ourselves against the risks of future models. And there, I think the EU also does a very good job of pointing to the downstream attack surfaces. So it's not like just the information on how to create a bioweapon is enough to cause a bioterrorism incident, right? The way that actually happens is people have to use that information to come up with these agents, to create them in the lab, a process that often takes tens of years even for the most talented scientific research groups. So the way to prevent these attacks is also, like, in my view, one of the best ways is downstream. In DNA synthesis facilities and incorporating AI into DNA synthesis units, which is a proposal that was raised, I think, earlier this month by the Federation of American Scientists. And that's another way open source AI or open foundation models can help in defense by scanning for what types of synthesis instructions are being given and so on, and tilt the balance in favor of defense as opposed to offense.
And thanks for the broad range of benefits and risks. A lot of our conversation so far is focused on thinking about the marginal risks, right? Over thinking critically and analytically about what the marginal risks are over some baseline. And what should the proper baseline comparison be? Is it the top closed weight models, or is it as you mentioned, Wikipedia or Google? Are there?
So I approach it kind of with two questions, right? So the first baseline is what new risk is introduced by AI writ large? And I think it's important to kind of understand that there are significant risks introduced into society with AI systems. And Kevin, you're kind of touching on some of those important pieces with CTT's focus of poorly understood systems that are used for making high stakes consequential decisions. And clearly there's regulation needed to make sure that those things are handled appropriately. There's also a number of societal challenges from criminal misuse, and we can think about misinformation, deep fakes, malicious activities that require a lot of expertise, whether that's bioweapon, cyber, or others. It's important to consider thus far that a lot of those misuses are raised, or like the number of folks who are able to do a lot of these things, it's supported by a user interface that lowers the barrier to entry to use the technology. And so, at the outset, AI introduces these risks, but these risks are introduced by both open and closed models alike.
Yeah.
There's reporting yesterday about concerns of deepfakes in the Bangladesh election ahead of January. And reporting at FT points to specific commercial applications that are enabling people at low cost to develop these. It's not somebody in their basement using a locally run open source model. But that's the second important question is, what is that difference between the closed and the open, right? That marginal baseline, it's worthy to think there are new risks that are introduced by openly available. And I think you've already touched on some of them, right? So if we're concerned about somebody taking model weights and being able to work in secret in their lab and build something that might not be surveilled actively if it were through API, that in practice, you face a lot of challenges taking malicious steps beyond information retrieval that can be observed by law enforcement and addressed. And like a second, I guess, a second kind of marginal risk that I would say is the concern of undoing a lot of the protections that might be offered on either an API kind of context with filters, but in the locally run model, Llama 2 safety filters being undone. It's important to call out here, you need some skill to undo these filters, right? These fine-tuning methods. And while the cost of doing this is not prohibitively large, especially in contrast to creating some of these large language models, that is a barrier. If someone were to kind of maliciously fine-tune a model and then seek to release that into the world to wreak havoc and help all the script kiddies do a lot of bad things, we live in a society that has institutions and platforms that have handled dual-use software and its distribution for decades. GitHub has acceptable use policies that if somebody is to intentionally or share a model or an AI system that is intended for harm, say for deep fake generation for, say, sexual purposes or terrorist content, that's in contravention of our policy, and we take that content down. you'd see this across the internet broadly. And so the risk profile of fine-tuned models by malicious actors shared to the wide masses to wreak havoc is very narrow, and I think can be addressed by law enforcement. We need to balance that against the benefits.
And Elizabeth, you seemed like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to jump back in on the biosecurity point, and back to this idea that, again, what we're not necessarily concerned about primarily are the systems we have now. So there's this great report that came out by the Center for Long-Term Resilience that outlined different uses of the way that foundation models are being used in biological design. And it's not just about protein folding. It shows like all the way from like initial protein folding all the way through the biological workflows down to experimental design and biological synthesis and just throughout the entire process, and showing how different systems exist at different stages of development for these different processes. And the concern we have is that down the road, when you can integrate these different systems, that we might then have systems that really lower the barrier to entry. So people can, great user interfaces, people can use these systems to carry out biological workflows all the way through. But to be clear, I think in the first instance, what we're going to see is that these systems just help people who are already very well resourced and have lots of expertise. So in that case, like in the first instance, marginal risk, probably small. But I do just want to keep our eye on the ball in that a lot of these conversations, we're not worried about the immediate marginal risk. We're worried about the things that are that may happen down the line, and keeping an eye on that.
I understand that. I guess my question there, and I think we've all talked about this and we'll talk about it more, is like the risks you're describing from those future systems aren't coming from the supermodels.
No, that's the one thing about biological risk.
Well, and it's
coming
the same
from the
thing
small
about
models.
some of the other risks that we've been mentioning.
Yeah.
They don't actually require the largest models. And so what is an appropriate line to draw is the line of 25 or 26 megaflops, depending on whether you're looking at the EO or the EU. Is that even a rational line? I think is a worthwhile question when the risks that we seem most worried about, which are information about how to create weaponry, or the kinds of harmful speech we've been talking about, can be and will be generated by much smaller models, where an attempts at non-proliferation of those models will fail.
So on the question of like, where do we draw that line? I think that we need to think of like two different cases. So we have the case of like models that we're worried about with biological risk, which are smaller, more fine-tuned, specific models, and then we have larger language models that have the issues around like mis and disinformation, loss of control risks, even building highly persuasive AI systems. So for systems that we're worried about with biorisk, I think they're having like concentrating more on the downstream places where it's like, okay, make sure people can't get their hands on the DNA synthesis tools and stuff like that. That's probably the best place to focus. However, when we look at the risks and harms that we're worried about with, and oftentimes more speculative risks and harms, but nonetheless important with these larger models, I think this 10 to the 25 flops that's been laid out in the EU AI Act, I am very in favor of it. I think we could probably all agree that having a compute threshold cutoff is like a really bad proxy for deciding model capability. But the nice thing about it is that it's a very clear line that can be written out very clearly in legislation. So it gives a very nice, clear starting point. And then one thing I really like that the EU AI Act has done is it says like, okay, this is our line, and we're just going to assume that if you're above 10 to the 25 flops, that this is a high systemic risk system. But if you can show us that it's not posing these kinds of risks or showing these capabilities that we're worried about, then maybe we'll drop you down to the tier below. And if you're at that tier below, but your systems are showing some pretty sketchy capabilities that we're worried about, then we're going to bump you up. And so having that like clear line that you can then kind of toggle around based on different kinds of benchmarking, capability analysis, I think that's a great starting point that we can then layer on top of.
I do want to get back to the compute threshold question, but before we do that, I just want to pose a more general question about the policy interventions and, what kinds of policy interventions are best suited toward addressing the marginal harms that we're talking about from open weight AI. Are there policy benefits that also could stand, to put us in a position where we're particularly benefiting from open weight AI? And I want to give this one to Sayash first.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I think in terms of policy interventions, we must be prepared for a world in which unaligned models exist. I think that's the bottom line. We cannot sort of pin all our hopes on the fact that model alignment techniques will be universal and that no one will have access to unaligned models. So then what do? We need to take a more systemic perspective on how to deal with such risks. Elizabeth mentioned downstream protections. I think that's the big one. And these types of protections, they translate very well to these other risks as well. So in terms of cyber defense, it means putting in more investment into like cybersecurity, vulnerability detection using LLMs. In biorisk, it is DNA synthesis tools. In disinformation, it is actually incentivizing social media platforms where the disinformation actually spreads to up their game when it comes to detection and removal of this type of disinformation. So I think that's one type of mechanism to sort of detect and prevent all of this harm. And then when it comes to benefits, I suppose one of the best examples comes from the US government. So the US government's Office of Management of Budget has been one of the strongest supporters of open source systems in the past, because of a requirement that in many cases, the vendors providing their tools have to make their models open source. So any requirements on open sourcing these models probably would be compelled speech. Like you cannot have like a general sort of diktat that everyone should open source their models. But for the models that we want to scrutinize most heavily, for the models that are used in most critical infrastructure, I think that's one type of policy lever that can work very well at increasing transparency around these systems and also making sure that we are not using the stick approach too much. We are also offering the carrot.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that. So in terms of like what can we do to promote the benefits, I think it's also not just about supporting open source. It's about supporting the whole open source ecosystem, which means we need if you want people to participate in open source development, providing compute infrastructure, providing support tools, educational opportunities, I think that's all part of really reaping the benefits from open source ecosystems. I think when it comes to regulating to prevent risks, I would really emphasizing having regulation across the AI value chain. So especially in the deliberations around the EU AI Act, one of the main issues was, well, who's responsible for the regulatory burden? Are we regulating the developers? Are we regulating the deployers? And I think the answer needs to be both. Developers of systems need to be responsible for the quality of the systems they're put out, do safety checks, but you also need the deployers and providers of the systems to make sure that they're putting out quality products. And when we talk about the AI value chain, we're talking all the way from initial data gathering and data processing and how that's done, making sure data sets aren't biased, all the way through model development and training, model deployment, and then model operation and monitoring as well. So having things in place throughout this whole system is what we need to do to keep ourselves safe.
Peter, having come from GitHub, I am particularly interested in your perspective on realizing the benefits of openness in this space.
Sure. I like a lot of the comments that I've heard thus far, and maybe can transition and talk a little bit about the EU policymaking context, which I think is very informative of having kind of 2 years on democratic deliberation and outcomes that have come up very recently on topics that we're thinking about. But before jumping to that, I really do appreciate, Sayash, your kind of points around the government kind of support for open source, and Elizabeth, kind of just the broader, like, how can we expand compute resources for underserved actors? I think the National AI Research Resource is a great kind of proposal along these lines. Generally, as I kind of outlined, one of the key benefits in my mind of open source and openly available model weights is really research. Research to understand security, research to understand the safety and improve that for closed or open models. And kind of expanding eval science, I think, is going to be a helpful point for open source and for closed source. The government efforts under NIST, under the EO, are going to be very useful in terms of identifying those benchmarks or capabilities and red teaming and a lot of the evaluation science that we do need. A key question in my mind is how can we support open source stakeholders with those best practices to implement them in practice? Is this something we have, in order to see the benefits, we really need to make sure that we give the tools to open source developers to kind of build securely and implement securely. But should you want to say something before I jump to the AI?
Yeah. Well, Yeah, before we dive into the AI Act, although I think this will be relevant to it as well, I do think it's important and relevant that the EO did mention when talking about what to do around open source is that it explicitly mentioned self-regulation as well as regulation. And I think that's important because I think what we expect developers to do and what we think it's appropriate for a government to require, or especially the US government to require, likely will be different. For example, like we have collaboratively in a scrum of policy ultimately arrived at norms for companies to follow around trust and safety. Those are things that we would not let the government dictate because we don't want the state to have disproportionate power over the major platforms that define how we communicate or learn things. That's just good policy. It's also a First Amendment value. But that doesn't mean we don't need to use every tool in our toolbox to push developers to invest as much as possible in safety in proportion to how much they're investing in capability. But I think that means we need to be very clear to them and to ourselves about which problems we are targeting and make sure that whatever interventions governments are proposing are narrowly tailored to address and are actually likely to address those problems. One, because that's just good policy. Two, because it's probably required by the First Amendment.
Did you have a follow-up to that you wanted to?
No notes, I love it. But I did want to pick up on the thread that Elizabeth mentioned around kind of allocating liability and responsibility in the value chain, drawing on the AI Act, if that's all right,
sure.
Briefly. So, GitHub has been quite involved in EU policymaking as European folks are looking at taking the product liability and product regulation scheme and the CE marks that we're all well aware of to the digital world. And that's in the AI Act, that's in the Cyber Resilience Act for cybersecurity that just closed in November, and that's in the Product Liability Directive, which is in the process of closing the final trilogue. And all three of those files have addressed open source and the question of upstream, downstream. And I think it's helpful to see what those outcomes are and what we might learn in the US context. So, as you rightfully kind of called out, Elizabeth, there are particular cases where open source is treated the same as closed source, and the largest models, 10 to the 25 flops at training, are given the presumption, regardless of whether they're open or closed, that those need to be within the scope of the most stringent expectations on upstream models. That's an exception to the larger kind of norm that we've seen in these three files, which is really a clear distinction between upstream development and downstream deployment. And there's a huge focus, or the liability and the expectation to comply with the rules across these three files is on the downstream. It's on the folks who are integrating components that they might find on the internet for free from open source contributors, whether that be a company or an individual, and they're integrating that into a digital product, into an AI system. They're then offering that to customers, and the expectation is that they're going to make sure that customers are not harmed, right? So the liability is really falling on folks downstream, and that's having knock-on benefits where the folks upstream are continued to be free to innovate. You can have a graduate student who's able to put out a model that might be incredibly useful for folks downstream, but not face the burdens of compliance because they're offering this for free. And we're seeing folks downstream incentivized, right, to choose the correct package. So if you as Siemens are thinking about integrating some kind of software component, you could pick the one that's maintained actively and has some certification from OpenSSF and is kind of clearly visible on GitHub. Or you'd hopefully choose that as opposed to something that was put up over the wall as a final project for a PhD student. And so that norm has been kind of established or recognized and maintained in these three files in the EU context. And there are exceptions, and I think that it's the risk-based approach to finding where we need to draw those exceptions, right? So open source systems in the AI Act, we haven't seen the final text. We have the political agreement. We've seen some leaks, so we need to caveat it, of course. High-risk systems, you're in scope. You shouldn't be able to get around this idea of you find a loophole because simply the system is open source. And same with banned systems. Same with systems that face obligations for transparency. So someone will not lawfully be able to take a model, implement it into a system that purports to be a human and lies to the end user, right? Regardless of open source or closed source. And so I think it's important to acknowledge there are exceptions to kind of this carte blanche for open source, but generally this distinction between upstream developers who are enabling folks to do many things and the downstream folks who are integrating them into commercial products that affect people's lives directly, facing the burdens, is supporting open innovation to continue from a risk-based perspective in the EU. And there are certainly lessons for us to draw here in the US.
So I know we could talk about the EU AI Act for weeks if we got the chance. I want to return very briefly, at least, to the question of compute thresholds that the EU AI Act raises, and also raises the AIEO here has raised. And I was a little surprised by how positive the sentiment around weights were, but I want to open the floor for a moment for folks to give not about weights, about compute. I want to open the floor for a moment for folks to talk about the compute thresholds and what might be the positive and negative uses of compute thresholds when we're thinking about risk, especially in open weight models.
I can start. So I think if we look at what the actual risks of open foundation models have been so far, presumably the biggest risk, as Kevin alluded to earlier, has been the risk of non-consensual pornography. So we have NTIA that has been enabled by open foundation models spreading across the internet. In particular, in its most pernicious form, I think it's CSAM, which is sort of spread across the internet. And in fact, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported a sharp uptick in the amount of CSAM content that they've received. A lot of it was attributed to open source AI systems. So I think one of the biggest challenges with open foundation models is exemplified by this sort of spread, because in this case, it really was the hobbyists who were tweaking these systems, removing the safeguards for generating nudity or pornography and putting this content on the internet, right? So what do we do about it? And how does the compute threshold come into the picture? Well, it turns out that the models used for creating such images can run on your iPhone. They can be trained using orders of magnitude lesser money compared to the state-of-the-art frontier models. Anyone can download this system today on your iPhone on the App Store and use it to generate NCII. And I think that presents a real issue, and it really problematizes the definition of compute thresholds in the first place, because the biggest risks that we have already seen from these systems require AI models that are not really like the frontier. They're not even close to the frontier. There are things that can be run on your MacBook or on your iPhone. So I think this points to the limitations of this compute threshold as a way to manage risks. And this also points to the limitations of the non-proliferation regime in the first place, as Kevin mentioned, because we cannot expect to make sure that these models don't proliferate, because malicious users can simply train their own. In fact, the models that have already been released so far are already good enough to create NCII and CSAM. So this to me seems like an issue, because on the one hand, we're talking about what risks of AI we want to mitigate. Well, the biggest risk to mitigate would not be mitigated by compute thresholds one bit. And it would not be mitigated by non-proliferation. And so this really points to the downstream interventions, to where we can sort of actually look at the attack surface where this harm actually happens. And we've seen examples of this working out. So one of the bigger platforms where NCII content was being shared was this platform called Civit AI. It's a community forum for people sharing AI-generated images where a lot of NCII was shared. And over the last 2 weeks or so, the platform, in response to backlash from users as well as the community, has for the first time started taking efforts to address the problem of NCII. So this shows that even though we cannot fully resolve the problem or the risks posed by open foundation models in this way, one of the best things we can do today is focus on the downstream harm, to focus on the attack surfaces where such harm actually happens, and to make sure that the existing sort of social contract that we have, where companies are responsible for downstream harms on their platforms, even if protected by Section 230. I guess we should continue to push for such interventions as demonstrated by Civit AI's case.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think it comes back to this idea of different models, different risks. So I think you're completely right. There's a whole bunch of risks that will not be covered just by having this 10 to the 25 flops cut off. And like I said, this is this is the sexual abuse material. This is, so lots of stuff around image generation, a lot of biorisk implications. And I think in these spaces, you're right, we need to focus on the downstream harms. I wouldn't say, though, that means that having this compute threshold is a bad idea. I think the compute threshold is really important for a different class of risks. These are the more far future risks, the things people are worried about when they talk about loss of control risks, highly persuasive AI. these are the things that we are seeing coming down the line, and having this compute threshold and watching that frontier is equally as important. I know there's been a lot of tension and a lot of discussion between, do we need to care about AI ethics issues, or do we need to care about these more long-term AI safety issues, very often wrapped up in discussions around existential risk and extreme risk. And I think the answer needs to be both. We cannot focus on one or the other. There are, like you said, some extremely important risks, probably the most prevalent risks being realized right now, that are around bias and discrimination and harmful material being shared online. Just because we haven't seen existential risks come to play, or more extreme risks come to play in the AI context yet, does not mean that those are not things we shouldn't be looking out for. And I think when you're looking at that threshold, when you're looking at what the more highly capable models down the line could do, having that compute threshold is a really nice cutoff for being able to say, like, hey, let's watch what the frontier is doing. Does that mean that the most dangerous systems are necessarily going to be above that threshold? Maybe not. We're seeing amazing things being done with compute efficiency and algorithmic efficiency. We might get some pretty amazing capabilities below that compute threshold. So I think that just means, we need to be flexible. We need to reevaluate the thresholds, and also have the flexibility, like I said, to sort of move models between tiers depending on the capabilities that we're evaluating.
I just want to second that the sort of polarization between the catastrophic risk and the more, I hate to say mundane risk, but immediate risks, division harms
happening today.
is not helpful. Especially because so much of the mitigation work that needs to be done will be the same, regardless. OpenAI and Anthropic, for example, are very catastrophic risk focused. They're also doing an enormous amount of mitigating immediate harms and risks, probably at a greater proportion in terms of their investment of money and people than the biggest companies. And so we'd like to see those percentages change at the bigger companies too. Where I differ, I think, or where I think we're all going to need to have a conversation to get to the bottom of it is, if we're all agreed that the likely risks that we see, including chemical, biological, and nuclear, are likely not going to be prevented by a cap, then what risks specifically are we trying to prevent? And if they are very speculative, speaking generally, we've not regulated super speculative risk, and we certainly haven't done that when it could impact access to what I think we're all basically describing as quite possibly the most useful general purpose tool for knowledge and expression we've ever seen. And so I think really, and this is not saying we should not worry about these. I think this is agreeing that we need much more research to much more concretely define what are the risks we expect from the largest models? Because right now, I think it's very unclear.
Yeah, I think much more research is the key starting point here. But I also think we need to realize that we're not regulating just because we aren't seeing evidence of the harms is maybe not the best option either. We need to basically, let's be prepared. Let's have procedures, policies in place for the if scenario. So this isn't saying necessarily like regulate the systems we have now, but be prepared to regulate what might come down the line, and identifying what some of those thresholds are. So I think like that's where we need to focus.
And yet another reason to love the EO from my perspective is that they are kind of charting this middle ground, right? It's about monitoring models at this level. It's not about mandating, regulating. It's about reporting to the government about what kind of practices are being done and risks that are being found to support future policymaking as evidence comes down the pike. And I would agree that there is need for caution at the frontier. There's been in the community like a motivated an ongoing assumption, I would say, that there are kind of emergent capabilities that we fail to predict, and that is motivating a lot of policymaking. I think it does warrant caution, but it's also worth noting that this week NeurIPS is happening in New Orleans, and the paper that was out of Stanford about 6 months ago, our emergent abilities, a Mirage, won Outstanding Paper award. So one of the top awards in the entire conference, clear signal from the research community that we need better evaluation science to be able to predict capabilities so that we can move to a more informed future on these questions.
Why that was important, just so in case they don't understand emergent.
I think, Sayash, you were giving me a great download on this in the hallway, so I would look to you if you don't mind. I'm happy to give an attempt, but.
Sure, yeah. So I think the key contribution of this paper was just to say that a lot of claims about emergent capabilities in models actually come down to the metric that you choose to evaluate them. So seen one way, they look as emergent capabilities, but seen another way, they just look as gradual progressions. And in that sense, they're extremely predictable.
Before we open it up to audience questions, I want to return one last time to the question of benefits, and especially in research and innovation, which is something that we've been talking about a lot here today. I think it's easy for research and innovation to be, and related concepts to innovation like competition, to be relatively abstract questions of like, the more open the model, the more research innovation you get. Can you offer concrete examples or thoughts on how, especially open models, might contribute or supercharge the ability for researchers and innovators to use AI in ways that we might want them to? And that's for anyone.
I can take a stab at it. Yeah. Sure. So I think, it cannot be overstated how important open models have been in the last 2 years or so in terms of research. So as Peter and Elizabeth have mentioned, we really don't understand a lot of the sort of reasons behind why language models work the way they do, and I think that's sort of the clearest strand. So here are a couple of concrete examples to Kevin's point. So the first is this work out of Zico Coulter's lab at CMU, which basically showed that you can add adversarial strings at the end of a language model prompt to bypass safety filters, even for closed models. So this is research that would not be possible. It's literally impossible to do this research without access to a language model, because it requires looking at the weights and the gradients and so on. And so this is research that we can directly pinpoint towards and say that this research was enabled by open access to models. There is a plethora of such research. So another sort of strand of research is on verifying what data was used to train a language model. And in particular, this type of research might be useful if it comes down to liability issues for copyright protection and so on. And if it comes to verifying whether a language model was trained on a particular data set or not, we actually did not have any way of doing that until this paper came out 6 months back. And so this is one other sort of type of innovation that is being enabled. I would say that all of these sort of research advances require access to different level of assets. So this last paper that I mentioned requires access to the data, the code, as well as the model gradients. And so this also highlights the gradient of open release that we talked about earlier. The further along you are on the gradient, the more visibility you have into sort of the data sets used to train the models, the code, as well as the models themselves, the easier it becomes to do this type of research. So in general, a lot of the research has been enabled by the extreme ends of the gradient. And in particular, for instance, nonprofits like Eleuther AI, which have released their models as well as the code and the checkpoints of the models, what happened to the models while they were being trained openly. And I think so this really sort of underscores the importance of open source AI, and where you have access to the entire sort of chain of materials that was required to prepare a model.
Yeah, I might comment on market concentration as well. So, one strong argument in favor of open source is if you have open source models, it allows more people to learn from the models, to use them, to employ them downstream, to build on top of them. You have many more people joining and getting involved in the AI market space. And that's huge for disseminating profits away from a key few players, allowing more people to benefit, not just from the use of AI, but being able to develop much more diverse range of technologies. I think there is a lot of uncertainty, though, in an open question around how important open sourcing highly capable frontier models is going to be for market concentration, or making healthy market concentration. And this has to do just with the cost and the amount of compute that it takes to train these extremely large models. For example, I think it's projected that training GPT-5 might cost somewhere in the region of, 10 billion or something like that. It's an absurd amount of funding. So I think when we talk about open sourcing these large models, we're not 100% sure that those are necessarily going to be the most commercially viable systems. We might have a lot of the capabilities that these large models have in much smaller models, and that open sourcing these smaller models will actually do the vast majority of the work for getting lots of people involved and being able to benefit from this open space. And if that's the case, then open sourcing these larger models might not have the most significant impact on market concentration. We don't know that yet, though. There's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know how this is going to unfold. A lot more research is needed to understand where these capabilities are going to go. If it is the case that some of these more frontier models really do have just like extreme leaps in capability, and those are the most commercially viable systems, then the impact of open sourcing these models on market concentration will be larger. So I just think that's something to focus on as well. As, there's a lot of arguments around market concentration, but there's a lot of uncertainty around how models are developed, where the capabilities are going to be, and how those capabilities balance with the costs of developing the models in the first place, which leaves just a huge question mark over what are the market implications of open source.
I mean, I'll add there, I agree with a lot of that. I think, though, if we talk about the large expense, one, that does also support the goal of having more of that be a public good rather than a company secret. But also, we've seen the release of the larger models has led to research, has enabled research that led to those smaller models where they're making exponential leaps in how can we make this much smaller while providing so much of the same value. And not only is that, I think, important knock-on benefits, but it also points the way toward a less centralized future internet where, for example, you could have most of your AI on your phone and only call to the big models, probably never if you're just a civilian trying to do normal stuff. And in that way, privacy is better, competition is better. You don't have single points of security failure in these centralized companies. Everyone says we can't make the same mistakes we made with social networks with AI. I would say that if we disincentivize decentralization of this power, we are exactly replicating the problem with social media, and that we ought to think more about how do we ensure dispersion and decentralization of that power. Because right now you see the social network market trying to build those models now as a replacement for the centralized models. I'd rather build them first.
If I may, I think that this is a great point to come back to this idea that there's a false dichotomy between completely open and completely closed, and that there are genuine risks associated with widely sharing weights, especially for more highly capable models. But there are also very genuine benefits in terms of model development, competition, and we need, if we're going to make progress and find this healthy balance, we need to do away with this open versus closed dichotomy. There are so many options between fully open and fully closed that we can pursue for research purposes, for downstream development purposes. They don't have necessarily all the benefits of open source, but they also don't have all of the risks. And I think part of this is going to be exploring some of those middle release options and seeing how can we get the most amount of benefit from them while preventing risks. And then I think on top of that, also understanding that there are often alternative options that we can use for pursuing some of the benefits traditionally associated with open source. So when we think the risks of open sourcing might be extremely high, we might be able to engage in other activities to try and get some of those benefits as well. So for example, for transparency, we could encourage impact statements to be published, information sharing with regulators. For distributing profits, we can attend to windfall clauses or taxation redistribution schemes. So these obviously aren't necessarily really straightforward options, but this idea of like where the risks are high, if there's a will for pursuing these benefits, there is a way. So I think the main thing I want to get across here, though, is just let's get away from these dichotomies of open versus closed, always open versus always closed, and the idea that if you're in one group or the other, that you're not saying all models should be closed or all models should be open. There's a lot of room in between to explore.
Agreed, and I'll just point folks to a policy paper that Sayash and his colleagues put out just today that has a really great discussion of the different spectrum of responsible release approaches. Building on work by Irene Solomon at Hugging Face, and maybe someone will ask questions about that spectrum.
Yeah, I suspect gradient is a word we'll be hearing quite a lot in the coming months. I do want to open it up for questions, and I know that there are questions coming in both from the internet and from folks in the room. But if you're in the room with questions, feel free. I think everyone has index cards on your seat, hopefully, and feel free to pass those over to, I believe that's your left.
Yes.
And in the meantime, I think these might be questions from the internet. So the first question, the first question is, how do we decide what risk level we can accept as a society as a trade-off for the benefits that we've been talking about today? It's a hard one.
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult question. I would say that we need to have democratic processes central to this decision making. So, this is a question from, we're gonna have lots of cultural variation, people from all different geographic locations, walks of life. So I think, implementing democratic processes to make decisions around acceptable thresholds is going to be key. There's some groups that are doing amazing work on this. So the Collective Intelligence Project, run by Divya Siddharth and Saffron Huang, they're doing great work in this area. And I would making my bid for democracy here.
I'll just add, I think we don't know the answer to that question, and I think we've left it unanswered in a lot of key places, because right now we talk a lot about introducing risk management systems. The EU AI Act is going to require it for high-risk systems. And we often stick at the issue of, well, wait, so what is the taxonomy of risks and what are the potential mitigations? We rarely talk about, okay, once you've identified those things, how is a company supposed to make that decision? How do they weigh those equities? Or is it just paperwork for them to articulate the risk and then the most senior executive signs off on that risk, which is not actually very helpful. So this is something that our governance lab, I think, is going to be trying to dig into, is how do we systematize making those decisions in a way that isn't just more compliance paperwork that doesn't actually make people safer.
Thank you. You know what? It might be since I have you all here anyway, it might be easier to flip back and forth between the index cards and people in the room. So I'll take a, yes, please. Go. Oh, yes, you, yes.
Oh, sure. I was interested in the panel's views on what level of testing companies should put their models through before releasing them openly, given, on the one hand, how much uncertainty and disagreement there is about what to expect from next generation models, what the marginal risk will be, and on the other hand, that once they're released, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. How do you think about, for different kinds of models, I guess especially for these sort of frontier models where the uncertainty is greatest, what responsible behavior looks like from the developers?
And I'll repeat the question for the folks watching, because I know the mics don't reach quite far back there. What kinds of testing should companies engage in before releasing these open weight models? Because and in particular, once the model is released, there is no unreleasing the model. So.
I'm a big fan of staged release as an option. So this is a process by which you basically release a smaller version of the model behind an API, so it's still reversible if bad things happen. You study how it's working, what are the societal impacts, how are people using it, how are people trying to misuse it, and then you implement safety filters, so on, and then you release the next bigger iteration and the next bigger iteration, more capable versions of the model, and taking a break at each step to understand how is it being used, how is it being misused, what are the societal impacts, and if everything's looking good, then I guess go ahead and open it up. But I think one nice thing about this process is in the process of staged release, if you're noticing that you're just layering on safety filters and implementing lots of fixes, that'd be a pretty good indication that if you were to open source that model, that those would all be things that could easily be removed to allow the model to be misused. And then that would be a risk assessment that you have to do and decide whether it's still worth it at that point. But I'm a big fan of staged release.
So evaluation science is not the science that we need today, right? The information and knowledge about how to do this well is not evenly distributed. It's in a few leading labs, and it's really encouraging that the executive order is mandating NIST to go and kind of identify best practices that can take some of that information and broadly disseminate it to society, so more developers have those state-of-the-art kind of evaluation methodologies without kind of espousing a particular view of whether they need to stage release that or not. But the idea of kind of performing appropriate evaluations before getting anywhere near the decision to release is clearly one. The EU AI Act, the text is shifting, as we've kind of called out already, but at that level of the general purpose models with systemic risk, there's kind of an acknowledgement expressly of adversarial testing as well. And so I think it's helpful to bring in more folks from the folks who just developed the model into the room to do some of that testing.
Yeah.
Again, not having any kind of bearing of whether you're not allowed to release the model or not. That's not in the legislation. Instead, it's about these are the types of processes that you should do. The more practice we can get about articulating best practices, getting them into standards, and spreading them beyond leading labs, the better place we're going to be.
Just a small addition, I think red teaming does and should imply external red teaming as well as internal red teaming, that is bringing other voices in and making sure that that is a diverse set of stakeholders, so you don't have the four of us telling you what to worry about, and instead have affected users and people who have different life experiences actually highlighting what they're most worried about.
Our next question is from the internet, and the question is, place yourself in the shoes of a founder and perhaps one working downstream of these open weight models. If you wanted to be responsible, what are the considerations, given a limited resources or a limited budget? What are the top priorities for making sure that your deployment of these models is safe and rights respecting?
I think it highly depends on the context of what service you're offering. Like, it's going to wildly diverge, and this is one of the benefits of fine tuning, which you can do on OpenAI's server, or you could do on top of an open model, because the kind of harms you want to guard against in a children's social app are going to be different from the ones you want to guard against in a system that decides how long someone gets parole, or what public benefits they get, or what medical care they get.
I'd add on as well, like one of the things being discussed in the EU AI Act was where the compliance costs are going to land. And so I think one thing to keep in mind is, like, if you're a downstream developer, you might not necessarily have the resources if you're building on top of a very large system that one of these mega companies put out. You might not have the resources or the know-how in-house to do the kinds of safety checks and stuff that might be legislated. So I think that this is an argument for coming back to this regulation through the value chain thing, making sure that developers of these systems are also doing the sort of broader but broader safety checks and evaluations before downstream developers get their hands on them. So that it's not all on the downstream developers, all the compliance costs, all the regulatory burden for making sure that deployments of these systems that work in ways unknown to us don't fall on these smaller developers. So making sure that those compliance costs are split between the upstream developers and the downstream developers.
Next question from
I was going to say, just setting aside kind of compliance costs and the kind of future regulatory approach, it's useful just to take a look on GitHub or Hugging Face and see, is there a model card that gives you assurance and confidence that the developer took effort and time to develop the model responsibly and gives you the information you need to put it into practice, taking expertise from folks in the deployed case in particular, because it does vary to your point, and do so safely. So look at documentation first and foremost. There's a lot of information that's out there, a lot of best practices.
And I think norms around that documentation are going to be really important, not least because the EU AI Act requires it, but gives very little detail on what it should look like. And so as we are, I think that's a really important point of intervention, including for NTIA and NIST, as they think about standards, just as NIST's work on risk management frameworks has been and will be really important in sort of populating the thinking of the EU AI Act's mandate for such systems.
I think we've got time for maybe 2 more questions. And so, yes, you in the back, sir. Yes, that's.
So Elizabeth, you mentioned the need when we assess risks to take in, we'll be taking into account different contexts. And democracy, we're at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Obviously a key one, not all countries express democracy the same way that we might here. And so what is the role of thinking about open source when they're not all players in this space will be using democracy to make decisions about how to move ahead with this technology?
And I'll just repeat the question. How should we be thinking about these decisions when when not all of the relevant players share the same values, for example, of democracy? So, Elizabeth.
That is a very tough question, and in some ways the question. So I don't know if I'll give a great satisfactory answer here. I mean, I think one thing we have going for us is, right now, most cutting edge frontier model development is happening in a handful of countries. So when it comes to the regulation of those models and making decisions about risk assessment around those, the regulation in those countries, mainly democratic countries right now, is going to be quite central. Open sourcing is important for distributing the use and benefits of these systems very widely. I think so. I think one thing that the EU AI Act does well is if we have legislation like this that has stipulations for best practice for major AI developers within the jurisdiction of that regulation, that will, in a way, kind of trickle down's a bad terminology, but it will have an impact in other countries where those systems are deployed, and also give those other countries recourse for being able to claim against harms from those systems based on the regulation in other countries. So I think that, if anything, that shows that the regulation in the EU AI Act and the regulation that we're considering here in the United States right now, this is standard setting, not just for our countries, but will have global impact as well. It's a really tough question.
I would just say you do raise a really hard question.
Yeah.
It ties into the marginal risk question, which is this a regulation that will ultimately not be helpful if any significant actor BitTorrents a highly capable model on a global internet, which will happen, is happening, and is happening coming from a variety of countries, some of which we don't agree with on a lot of things.
And I think this really goes back to the point that we cannot rely on alignment of individual models as a mechanism for systemic safety. Unaligned models are going to exist, they already do exist, and I think we cannot rely on the fact that a single model or a set of models even would comply with these regulations as a means of curbing their misuse. We have to rely on things that are more robust than that, things like downstream protections and so on. And I guess this also comes back to the point about compute thresholds in some sense, because while 10 to the 26 or 10 to the 25 or whatever number of flops you want to regulate at might seem like a huge number today, the compute costs for creating these models go down exponentially over time. So as one example, between 2012 and 2019, over a span of 7 years, the cost of creating an image model with the same amount of capabilities went down 44 times, right? And this process is only improving and increasing as we invest more into AI-specific chips and AI-specific sort of architecture improvements and so on. So all that is to say that any sort of concrete number we come up with is likely to be meaningless 5 years from now, simply because a group of gamers in a LAN party will all be able to hook up their gaming laptops next to each other and train the same model.
And perhaps one final question from the room, if anyone. Russ.
Hi, Russ Hansar, NTIA, with a very self-interested question, also on the democracy point. So, effective democratic self-governance requires some degree of expertise, knowledge, basic understanding. I think it's also the case that AI policy issues will be best addressed in part by a population that is savvy about misinformation, about deepfakes, about bias, and so on. What can tech policymakers do to help facilitate and engender an AI-savvy, AI-literate population?
Yeah, so the question is, given the importance of the expertise that you all bring to the table, what can tech policymakers do to foster that conversation, among the population as a whole?
Talk to CDT. That wasn't a joke.
I mean, I think that there's a lot to say for educational campaigns more widely. Having people interact with the systems is also huge. I mean, this is what we saw with the release of ChatGPT. AI went from a thing that AI researchers talk about to something that the whole world was talking about. Suddenly my grandmother was asking me about my job, and that was weird. But but this is, having, interaction with the technology, nice user interfaces, people can experience the systems. If you're able to create images yourself, then that opens your mind to, the great things the system could do, but also potentially the nefarious uses it could put to as well. So I think firsthand experience is huge. And then in the process of actually making policy, making these decisions, have lots of stakeholder engagement, opportunity for bringing people into the room, have these discussions. And yeah, that would be the way forward on that. But I think from just like a base, like population in general, how do we educate? Let them experience.
I mean, yeah, to that point, I completely agree. And I'm not sure how many of you saw the image of the Balenciaga Pope, like the Pope in the puffer. I think that was a great example of like, not really an example of misinformation, right? Like it was a meme that went viral. And through that meme, I think a lot of people realize what the capabilities of these models are. Mm-hmm. So I suppose that's like a prime example of, insulation against these types of concerns proliferating to the general audience.
Societal inoculation via meme. I like that quite a bit. Yeah, I want to kind of plus one the point on education. Yes, we can have kind of great kind of public education campaigns. I know CISA's running one on cybersecurity best practices and hygiene. We might imagine something in the future around AI disinformation. But there's a plug, I think, for open source in particular. This is a great opportunity to get small models in the hands of computer science students. We can push and increase computer science education broadly, I think is going to be very important. And enabling more folks to build and tinker with these models, they might go on to careers that are not in certain large companies and instead get to work for the government. So I think that's an important piece in the medium term. And to Elizabeth's great point on open consultation, seeing a lot of stakeholders participate, I think that it's really encouraging that the Biden administration went the route of consulting and giving you this hard task at NTIA to get widespread input on this challenging question of widely available model weights. And it's, I would implore you to listen to folks who are building and using these tools day in, day out to see what they can do when they're given that ability to tinker with the model weights directly.
I have just one addition, which is, well, two. One, on a lighter note, I would advise policymakers to watch less science fiction in the sense of, I watch science fiction. I love science fiction. but I do think it is fair to say that the portrayals of AI in science fiction over the past several decades have somewhat polluted the discourse and how we talk about it now and how civilians who aren't familiar with the technology think about it. And like pictures of the Terminator don't help. On a more serious note, I think more technical expertise in Congress is critical. I would highlight especially the great work of Tech Congress, which puts tech literate fellows on the Hill. But we need more systemic approaches to better educating our policymakers and staffing them with technical experts.
Well, thank you very much. And on that note, I have one final question, and it's a good one. It's from the live stream, which is how do we decide? Oh, nope, that's we've done that one. What opportunities are there to contribute to the executive order or NTIA policymaking on this topic, which I can take? As Assistant Secretary Davidson said, this is really the first step in our consultation process. We hope to do more public outreach. We'll for sure be doing, a public request for comment as directed by the executive order, and we encourage everyone to make your voice heard in that proceeding. We are really privileged and excited to be able to engage with so many brilliant people across the policymaking spectrum and across different stakeholder groups, and we really look forward to hearing from you in person, over the internet. We have an open door policy, so please reach out. So with that, I really want to thank CDT and our wonderful panel here for being both such great hosts and such great panelists, and hope to see you soon.